I never meant for it to happen. One moment, it was playful glances, a brush of fingertips over a drink, a teasing comment that lingered just a little too long. The next, I found myself in a situation that was anything but innocent. It started with Greg, my husband's best friend. He was at our house often, barbecues, game nights, casual Sunday visits. My husband Jason always trusted him, always believed that the bond they had since college was stronger than anything. And why wouldn't he? Greg was married too. His wife Lauren was the picture of suburban perfection. Homemade pies, charity events, matching family outfits and Christmas photos. If anyone was off limits, it was Greg. But that's exactly what made it so thrilling. I don't even know when it shifted. Maybe it was the night Jason fell asleep on the couch after too many beers, and Greg and I kept talking. Or maybe it was the afternoon he came by while Jason was at work, claiming he had left something behind after the last game night. I should have known then, the way he looked at me, the way his eyes stayed on my lips when I spoke. It was a silent acknowledgement of something simmering just beneath the surface. Then came the night it all changed. Jason had a late meeting, and I was home alone, enjoying a glass of wine, mindlessly scrolling through my phone when Greg's name popped up. The text was harmless enough, just a joke about Jason's terrible fantasy football picks. But then another came, and another. Before I knew it, I was laughing, my body tingling in a way I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just flirting, it was a slow burn, a game of pushing boundaries without ever acknowledging the line. And when Greg asked if he could stop by, just for a drink, I didn't hesitate. I told myself it was innocent, that we were just friends, that nothing would happen. When he walked in, though, I felt it instantly. The air between us was thick with something unspoken, something neither of us wanted to say out loud. He looked around, noticed the wine glass in my hand, and smirked. "Didn't want to drink alone?" he asked. I shrugged, feeling my pulse quicken. "Guess not." Greg poured himself a glass, settled into the couch, and for a while we kept up the game. Light conversation, harmless laughter, but then his fingers brushed my wrist as he reached for his drink, and I sucked in a breath. "You know," he said slowly, "I think we both know where this is going." I should have shut it down right there. I should have laughed it off, reminded him that we were both married, that this was dangerous. Instead, I leaned in just slightly, meeting his gaze. "Do we?" His hand moved to my knee, just resting there, warm through the thin fabric of my leggings. I didn't move it away. I didn't pull back. I just sat there, feeling his touch, letting the tension build until it felt like something might snap. The sound of my phone vibrating on the table made me jolt. Jason's name flashed on the screen, and I felt my stomach drop. Greg chuckled, not moving his hand, his thumb grazing my skin just enough to make me shiver. "You should get that," he murmured. I swallowed hard, grabbing my phone and answering, my voice steady even as my body betrayed me. "Hey, babe." Jason sounded tired, distracted. "Just checking in. Still at the office, but I should be home in an hour." An hour. 60 minutes. I had 60 minutes before my husband walked through that door. "Take your time," I said, glancing at Greg, whose smirk deepened. "I'll be here." When I hung up, there was silence. Heavy, thick, impossible to ignore. Greg set his glass down and leaned in, close enough that I could feel his breath against my skin. "Are you going to tell me to leave?" he asked. I should have. I knew I should have. Instead, I reached for his tie, curling my fingers around the silk fabric, feeling the power shift between us. "I should." He chuckled, low and knowing. "But you won't." I didn't answer. I didn't have to. The door clicked shut behind him, sealing us inside. And just like that, the game we had been playing was no longer just a game. The first few seconds after the door clicked shut, neither of us moved. The air was heavy, charged, thick with something neither of us wanted to put a name to. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, loud, fast, uneven. Greg's eyes were locked on mine, dark and unreadable, and I knew there was no turning back. I didn't want to turn back. He stepped closer, slow, deliberate, and I felt my breath hitch in my throat. His fingertips traced up my arm, light enough to make my skin tingle, heavy enough to make me desperate for more. My hands moved before I could stop them, sliding up his chest, feeling the heat of his body through his shirt. "You know this is dangerous," I whispered, but the words had no weight. They didn't matter. Greg's lips curled into that slow, knowing smirk. "That's what makes it fun." And then his hands were in my hair, pulling me toward him, and I was lost. His mouth was on mine, firm, hungry, demanding. I melted against him, pressing closer, feeling the way his body fit against mine. My fingers dug into his shoulders, anchoring myself as the room spun around us. I had forgotten what this felt like. The rush, the heat, the thrill of something that shouldn't be happening, but was happening anyway. We moved together in sync, like two people who had been waiting for this moment far longer than either of us would ever admit. My back hit the wall, and Greg's hands were everywhere, skimming my sides, gripping my hips, sliding beneath the fabric of my top. My breath hitched as he whispered against my lips, his voice thick with something primal. "Tell me you want this." I did. God, I did. But saying it would make it real, make it something I could never take back. So instead, I kissed him harder, answering in the only way that mattered. Greg groaned, his hands tightening around me as he lifted me effortlessly, pressing me against the wall, letting me feel just how much he wanted me. My body reacted instantly, arching into him, heat pooling low in my stomach. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew this was the moment to stop. This was the line we couldn't cross. But I didn't care. I didn't want to stop. I wanted more, needed more, and Greg was giving me exactly that. "We shouldn't." I gasped as his lips trailed down my neck, his teeth scraping lightly against my skin. He chuckled, the sound vibrating through me in the most intoxicating way. "But we will." And he was right. There was no stopping this, not now. Minutes blurred together, as clothes disappeared, as hands explored, as whispered confessions and quiet moans filled the room. It was reckless, desperate, exhilarating. Greg knew exactly what he was doing, and I let myself fall into the moment, into him, into something that felt too good to be wrong. By the time we finally collapsed onto the couch, tangled together, breathing hard, the weight of what we had just done started to settle in. I turned my head, meeting Greg's gaze, searching for any sign of regret. But there was none, only satisfaction, hunger, something that told me this wasn't a one-time thing. "We can't do this again," I whispered, but even I didn't believe it. Greg's fingers trailed down my arm, lazy and unhurried. "You don't sound convincing." I swallowed hard, knowing he was right, because even as my mind screamed at me to end this, to put space between us, my body was already craving more. And the worst part? I knew Greg felt the same. We had crossed the line, and there was no going back now. The next morning, I woke up before the sun, tangled in sheets that smelled like Greg. My body ached in the best way, a reminder of what we had done, of the line we had crossed, of the hunger we had given into so recklessly. But the moment I turned my head and saw him still asleep beside me, reality came crashing down. My heart pounded as I sat up, carefully untangling myself from him. The room was still dim, the early morning light barely creeping through the blinds. My phone was on the nightstand, and when I reached for it, my hands shook. One missed call. Jason. A wave of nausea hit me. Greg stirred beside me, his arm moving as if to pull me back to him, but I was already slipping out of bed, grabbing my clothes from the floor. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of here before I did something even more stupid, like let myself believe that last night meant something more than what it was. "Leaving already?" Greg's voice was thick with sleep, but when I turned to face him, he was watching me, his smirk lazy and knowing. "This was a mistake." My voice was barely above a whisper, but I needed to say it, needed to hear it out loud. Greg sat up, stretching, completely unconcerned. "You didn't seem to think that last night." I pulled my shirt over my head, swallowing hard. Last night was. What, fun? The best you've had in years? He arched a brow, and I hated how right he was. He ran a hand through his messy hair. You're going to tell yourself this can't happen again, right? Because it can't, I snapped, but my voice lacked conviction, and Greg knew it. It will. He leaned back, propping himself up on his elbows. You'll think about me when you're with him. You'll crave it. And when you do, you know where to find me. I clenched my jaw, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing how much his words affected me. Without another word, I grabbed my purse and bolted out of the room, out of the apartment, my heart racing the entire way home. When I finally pulled into my driveway, Jason's car was already there. My hands were still shaking as I stepped inside, forcing myself to act normal. Hey, babe! Jason called from the kitchen. He was standing by the stove, flipping pancakes, looking every bit the husband I had promised to be faithful to. The smell of coffee and syrup filled the air, and the warmth of home wrapped around me like a suffocating blanket. Hey, I managed, forcing a smile. My stomach twisted as he turned, grinning at me like he had no idea what I had done, no idea that I had betrayed him in the worst way. He walked over, pressing a kiss to my forehead. I missed you last night. Thought we could have had a late-night drink together, but you must have crashed early. I nodded quickly. Yeah, sorry, I was exhausted. He handed me a plate of pancakes, and I sat down at the kitchen island, my fingers gripping the fork too tightly. I should have felt guilty. I should have been drowning in regret, but all I could think about was Greg's touch, Greg's lips, Greg's voice whispering that I'd be back. And worst of all, he was right. Over the next few days, I told myself I would forget him. I would let this be a mistake, something that never happened. But it was impossible. My body still craved his. My mind still replayed every second of that night. Every time Jason touched me, it wasn't Jason I wanted. It was Greg. I avoided Greg's calls, ignored his texts, but he was always there, just on the edge of my thoughts. And then, as if the universe was playing some cruel joke, I saw him at the grocery store. I was reaching for a bottle of wine when I felt someone close behind me, the warmth of a body pressing just near enough to send my pulse racing. You ignoring me? Greg's voice was low, teasing. I swallowed hard, gripping the bottle tighter. I told you it was a mistake. Greg chuckled. And yet here you are, looking at me like you want to drag me into the back of this store and make the same mistake all over again. I spun around, heart pounding. Greg, stop! His eyes darkened as he stepped even closer. You don't want me to stop. I should have walked away. I should have left, but I didn't. Greg's fingers brushed against my hip, barely a touch, but it sent a jolt through me. You keep telling yourself you don't want this, but your body says otherwise. I hated how right he was. Meet me tonight, he murmured, voice thick with promise. Same place. I can't. He leaned in, lips brushing against my ear. You will. And then he was gone, leaving me standing there, shaking, my pulse racing. I should have left it alone. I should have walked away. But that night, I found myself driving back to him, knowing full well I was falling into something I couldn't control. The drive to Greg's place felt longer this time, but that was only because my mind wouldn't shut up. Every streetlight, every car I passed, it all felt like a reminder that I was doing something I shouldn't be. Again. But I didn't turn around. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles white as I let the guilt swirl around me without ever letting it settle. By the time I reached his apartment complex, my heart was hammering. I parked a few spaces down from his building, trying to convince myself that I could still leave, that I could turn the key in the ignition and drive home to my husband, crawl into bed beside him, pretend that I was the woman he thought I was. But my body betrayed me, just like it had before. My legs moved on their own, carrying me up the stairs, down the hallway, to the door I knew too well. I knocked once, my pulse a wild drum against my ribs. The door opened within seconds. Greg stood there, shirtless, his smirk already in place, like he knew I'd come, like he never doubted it for a second. "Couldn't stay away, huh?" His voice was low, teasing, that edge of cocky confidence that always made me weak. I exhaled sharply, pushing past him into the apartment. "This is the last time." Greg shut the door behind me. "Sure it is." I turned to him, jaw tight. "I mean it, Greg." He stepped closer, tilting his head. "Then why are you here?" I had no answer. I could have lied, told him I came to end things properly, to make sure he understood, but we both knew that wasn't true. His hands found my waist, fingers pressing just enough to send a ripple of warmth through me. "Say you don't want this, and I'll back off." My lips parted, but nothing came out. Greg's smirk widened. "That's what I thought." And then his mouth was on mine, and my body surrendered completely. The hours blurred into nothing. Skin against skin, whispered words, tangled limbs. It was intoxicating, consuming, a fire that I didn't want to put out. And when it was over, when we were breathless and spent, I laid there, staring at the ceiling, wondering how I could possibly go home and pretend none of this had happened. Again. Greg propped himself up on his elbow, watching me. "You thinking about him?" I turned my head to meet his gaze. "You don't get to ask me that." His fingers traced lazy circles on my hip. "You could leave him, you know." I sat up, pulling the sheets around me. "That's not an option." Greg exhaled, sitting up beside me. "You say that, but you keep coming back." I didn't have an answer for that either. Because he was right. I got dressed in silence, avoiding his gaze, trying to collect the scattered pieces of my sanity. Greg didn't push, just leaned back against the headboard, watching me with a knowing expression that made me feel even more exposed. As I reached for my purse, he spoke again. "You'll be back." I shook my head, gripping the doorknob. "I can't keep doing this." Greg smirked. "You say that every time." And I hated that he was right. The moment I stepped into my house, I felt the weight of my betrayal settle over me like a heavy coat. The lights were dimmed, and Jason was on the couch, watching something on TV, his face lighting up when he saw me. "Hey, you're home late." I forced a smile. "Yeah, lost track of time." Jason stood, stretching, walking over to press a kiss to my cheek. "Everything okay?" I nodded too quickly. "Yeah, just tired." He frowned slightly, eyes searching mine for something I prayed he wouldn't find. "You've been acting different lately." Panic flashed through me, but I shoved it down. "Work's been stressful." Jason studied me for a moment longer, then nodded. "You should get some rest." I exhaled, relieved. "Yeah, good idea." As I climbed into bed that night, Jason's arm draped over me like a protective barrier. I stared at the ceiling, mind racing. I had to stop. I had to end this. But deep down, I already knew. This wasn't over. Not yet. I told myself it was over, that I had to stop. But the pull was too strong, and before I knew it, I was back at Greg's door. He opened it without a word, a knowing smirk playing on his lips as he stepped aside to let me in. This time there was no hesitation, no pretense, no excuses. I had already crossed the line too many times to pretend I could turn back now. We crashed together in a fevered mess of hands and mouths, bodies tangled in a desperation I couldn't explain. I wanted him, needed him in a way that was beyond reason, beyond morality. Each time I swore it would be the last, I only found myself crawling back, caught in a cycle I couldn't break. But I wasn't naive. I knew it couldn't last forever. It happened on a Sunday. Jason had gone to visit his parents, leaving me alone for the afternoon. The perfect excuse. The perfect lie. Greg's apartment was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of him. We had barely made it past the entryway before clothes started disappearing, mouths clashing in a heat that I knew wouldn't cool until we had satisfied the hunger clawing inside us. But then, the knock came. At first, we ignored it. Greg kissed down my neck, his fingers skimming my skin, oblivious to the outside world. But the knock came again, harder this time, followed by a voice that made my stomach drop. "Greg, Open up. I know you're in there. Lauren. My heart stopped. My body froze. Greg pulled back, his face going pale as he registered what was happening. My pulse thundered in my ears as I scrambled for my clothes, hands shaking. I had been so careful. We had been so careful. How did she know? Greg swore under his breath, moving toward the door. I wanted to stop him, to tell him to lie, to make up some excuse, but it was too late. The moment he turned the handle, Lauren pushed inside, her eyes wild with fury. And then she saw me. The room was silent, thick with the weight of realization. Her eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, I saw every emotion hit her at once: rage, betrayal, heartbreak. She didn't look at Greg. She didn't scream. She just stared at me like she was waiting for an explanation, for something that could make this all make sense. But there was nothing I could say. The slap came so fast, I barely saw it coming. Pain bloomed across my cheek, but I didn't flinch. I deserved it, every bit of it. "You!" she hissed, voice shaking. "You were my friend!" My stomach twisted. The guilt I had been suppressing for so long came crashing down, drowning me. Greg stepped forward. "Lauren, Shut up." Her voice was like steel, cold and sharp. She turned back to me, her eyes burning. "How long?" I swallowed, my bappy throat dry. "A while." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away. "And Jason?" The nausea hit me full force. I couldn't answer, but she already knew. She exhaled sharply, shaking her head before turning on her heel. "You'll regret this." And then she was gone. The door slammed shut, leaving a silence so heavy it pressed against my chest like a weight I couldn't lift. Greg ran a hand through his hair, cursing under his breath. "We need to fix this," he said, voice tight. But I knew there was no fixing it. I dressed quickly, my mind racing. This was it. The end. I couldn't go home and pretend nothing had happened. Lauren wouldn't keep this to herself. She wouldn't give me that mercy. When I finally looked at Greg, I saw it in his eyes. He knew it too. "This was never going to last," I whispered. He exhaled, nodding slowly. "I guess not." I turned, walking out without another word. The cold air outside bit at my skin, but it was nothing compared to the ice in my veins. I got in my car, gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. By the time I got home, Jason was there, sitting at the kitchen table, his phone in his hands. The moment he looked up at me, I knew. Lauren had told him. He didn't yell. He didn't throw accusations. He just sat there, staring at me with a look that shattered me more than any screaming match ever could. "How long?" he finally asked, his voice hollow. Tears burned my eyes. "A while." He nodded, swallowing hard. I thought we were happy." I wanted to say something, anything, but there was nothing that could undo what I had done. He stood, running a hand over his face. "I need some time." I nodded, but my heart was breaking. "Jason, He held up a hand, stopping me. "Don't. Just don't." And then he walked away, leaving me standing in the wreckage I had created. For the first time, I felt the weight of everything crash down on me, crushing me, suffocating me. I had lost him, and there was no one to blame but myself.